Hi, this is the video where I want to look at some more advanced issues from the passage of the week. The passage of the week, Acts 1, 6 through 11, is where the disciples asked Jesus, "Are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" And interestingly, Jesus' answer isn't, "Man, you haven't understood a thing." His answer is, "It's not for you to know the times or the seasons." And at the end of this video, I will support the interpretation of Luke Acts that suggests that Luke did believe there would be a time when Jerusalem would once more be under the control of the Messiah and of Israel at the end of this. Of course, these verses are also the ascension, but I wanted to talk a little bit more on a little bit more advanced level about Messianic expectation at the time of Christ. Now, I can speak biographically here because I think I'm probably not unlike many who grew up hearing, for example, apologetics. It's mathematically impossible for this many predictions to be fulfilled in the life of one man, and therefore, not only is the Bible true, but Christianity is true. Now, of course, I do believe that the Bible is true, and I do believe that Christianity is true. But this particular argument, I have a feeling, will backfire on a lot of people if you use it with a genuine skeptic. I mean, it's one thing when you're talking to people who are already convinced. And the reason for this is, and this is not a problem with the Bible, there is nothing wrong with the Bible. But the problem with this argument is that if you look at a lot of the passages that the New Testament quotes, and you look at them, if you study how inductive Bible study and exegesis and how to read in context, what you come to the conclusion that the New Testament read the Old Testament like a Pentecostal did, or an old-fashioned Wesleyan. That is, they read the Old Testament spiritually, not necessarily contextually. For example, once upon a time I was deeply troubled at Hosea 11:1. If you look at Matthew 2. Of course, Jesus goes down to Egypt with his parents, and then they come out after Herod the Great has died. And Matthew says, "This happened that it might fulfill that which was spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son." And so I never really looked it up, but I expected that if I did, I would find this prediction in the Old Testament. In days coming, the Messiah will go down to Egypt, and then he'll come out, and out of Egypt I've called my son, or something like that. But of course, Hosea 11:1 isn't a prophecy at all. It's not a prediction at all. It's talking about the past from Hosea's standpoint, hundreds of years before Hosea. Hosea 11:1 and 2 say, "When Israel was a child, I called my son out of Egypt. But the more I called after him, the more he served other gods, the Baals and Ashtaroths," and so forth. So, one, this is talking about the past of Hosea, not the future. It's not a prediction. Two, it's talking about Israel, not about the Messiah. And third, it predicts that Israel will serve other gods, which is obviously not true of Jesus. And this was a bit of a conundrum for me once upon a time, because I was saying, is the Bible in error here? And of course, the Bible's not in error. What's in error are those who led me to think that this would be a prediction in the Old Testament. Most of the passages that the New Testament applies to Christ, the New Testament is reading them spiritually, or in a sensus plenior, a fuller kind of sense. Again, not a problem. The problem is this kind of I was set up for a crisis by individuals who didn't know how to read the Old Testament verses in context, or refused to. Sometimes very intelligent people have a certain perversity to their intellect. That is, they're not really interested in the most likely conclusion. They use their intellect to try to find ingenious ways to make the text say what they want it to say. At some point, I went through a faith crisis because of that kind of cooking of the books. Again, no problem with the Bible. This is not an error in the Bible, but it is a problem for those who set me up for failure, as it were. There are some Old Testament passages that do seem to predict a shoot from the branch of David, for example, Isaiah 11, or he will raise up the fallen booth of David, Amos 9. These seem to be predictions of a restoration at some point in the future of the Davidic king, which is, of course, interesting because at the time of the historical Isaiah, and at the time of the historical Amos, there was a king of David. And so some have suggested that these might be passages that are part of Isaiah and Amos from a later period. I think when you go through the fires of graduate studies, if it's a good program, you'll realize that this is a very viable option. It's not a problem. Again, we tend to assume that if it's not what I see is what I get, then there's a problem. Well, it wasn't written to me, and so for there to be other ways of putting together genres in the ancient world it should not actually be a problem. But of course, we don't get into these issues in the church because they're deeper. They cause people, they cause people to go into tailspins. But all of that is to say is, I do think that these two passages, whatever, and I'm not an Old Testament expert, but I would say that these two passages, then Isaiah and Amos, do indicate a messianic expectation. Yes, which of course is true, and which of course is Jesus. So again, these are true passages. There's no error in the passages. Haggai, interestingly enough, both this passage in Haggai, and then I think there's also some curious features to Ezra chapter 1. There's someone there named Sheshbazzar, and then Zerubbabel's in chapter 2, and you wonder, well, what happened to Sheshbazzar? But what I'm getting at here is, I wonder as I read these texts whether Israel hoped that Zerubbabel might be the first of a renewed line of David. But of course, it was not to be at that time. As far as we know, we just don't know after Zerubbabel. I don't think we know after Zerubbabel whether there were any descendants of David that were governors. They weren't kings, of course. This is the Persian period. They were governors who governed under the Persians. What am I getting at? I'm getting at is that we do have just the slightest hint of expectation that there would be an anointed one who would come back and rule Israel at some point. It's in context, there's not nearly as much as we might think. And so you won't be surprised to know, if once you take all this in, you won't be surprised to know that messianic expectation does not seem to have been a major theme during what we sometimes call the intertestamental period in early Judaism. As far as we know, for the bulk of the Persian period, and then after that the Greek period, there does not seem to be a significant amount of messianic expectation in the literature that has survived. Of course, not a lot of literature survives from the Persian period. So we begin about, in the 100s. In the 100s BC, we begin to see the rise of messianic expectation. And I think probably the Maccabean crisis, which took place around 167 to 164 BC, with Judas Maccabee, for example. I think probably the Maccabean period rekindled an expectation of a Messiah. The Apocalypse of Weeks, which is, by the way, the Animal Apocalypse and the Apocalypse of Weeks are two documents within a book called First Enoch. First Enoch is a composite document that kind of has different parts that have been put together over time. The earliest parts of First Enoch probably date to the 200s BC. And then, anyway, I'll try not to talk too much. The book of Jude actually quotes First Enoch, if you're interested in that. But the Animal Apocalypse, which is written after or around the time of the Maccabean crisis, is, as far as I can tell, and I didn't do a thorough study. I didn't read. I have a bunch of books on my shelf that have been lying dormant for about a decade now. But as far as I can remember, this quote from the Animal Apocalypse may very well be kind of the first beginnings of a revived messianic expectation. By the way, Messiah means anointed one. So we're talking about the anointed king. We're not talking about God or divine. We're talking about a human king. They weren't expecting a divine king. And I saw a white bull. Its horns were large, and the first one became leader among them. This seems to be the first revival of Messianic expectation that I can see since the 500s, basically, or the period right after they returned from exile. There are, of course, some historical individuals. I jump ahead here about 150 years, a little bit more, maybe 200 years. There was Judas the Galilean, who is mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 4. We'll get there eventually, Lord willing. Judas the Galilean tried to run a revolution about 6 A.D., failed. There's another guy named Judas in the 40s who tried to revolt, failed. So there was in this 1st century BC, 2nd century BC, and the time of Christ, Messianic secret had revived in some circles. More on that in a second. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls date to about 100 BC. Of course, they weren't all written at the Dead Sea, and so some of them may have been brought to the Dead Sea from other places. But here are some examples of Messianic thinking in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Interesting that the Essenes, so I'm one of those who believes that the Dead Sea Scrolls were largely produced by Essenes. I believe that the first Enoch that I was just talking about was created by either the Essenes or the maybe better, we should say the antecedents of the Essenes. And so there is a strand of Judaism that has a certain continuity with itself here. That is, there's an apocalyptic Judaism. Sadducees weren't looking for a Messiah, I don't think. Were the Pharisees looking for a Messiah? We don't entirely know whether they were or not during this period, but the Essenes certainly were. So in the community rule document, 1QS, 1 stands for the cave number, Q stands for Qumran, and then the stuff after it has to do with the labeling these fragments. But until the prophet comes and the Messiah of Aaron and Israel. So the Qumran people were looking for 2 anointed ones. They were looking for anointed king, the Messiah of Israel, and they were looking for an anointed priest, the Messiah of Aaron. They wanted a full restoration because, of course, the Essenes believed that the temple had been defiled and needed to be restored and purified. Here's similar in Covenant of Damascus, another one of these kind of manuals of discipline for the Qumran community. 4Q Florilegium is a fragment that is a kind of a collection of prophetic texts. Interestingly enough, this prophetic text is actually used in Hebrews. And so there's a number of kind of, I think, correlations between Essenes and the early Christians. I personally wonder if a number of the early Christians were actually Essenes. 4Q Testimonia. I will raise up for them a prophet from among their brothers like you, Moses. This is, again, Moses was understood to be a kind of king, a king prophet, as it were. It doesn't look like it's spelled right, but I guess it is. Isaiah Pesher, a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, very similar in the War Scroll. A shoot will emerge. These are allusions to Isaiah 11. And so here are examples of 2 scrolls from Qumran reading Isaiah 11 messianically. Lastly, there's a Son of God scroll. He'll be called Son of God, great God among the gods. I don't think this is saying, as some I believe have argued, I don't think this is saying that the Messiah will come from heaven and will be a heavenly figure. Son of God, I think, was a phrase used in reference to the king, as we see in 2 Samuel 7:14, maybe in Psalm 2, maybe in Psalm 89, maybe in Psalm 45. So this takes a little getting used to because we think Trinity, and of course I believe in the Trinity. But at the time of Christ, Son of God was a royal expression, not a ontological statement. Okay, so Psalms of Solomon, written around the time when the Romans took over Jerusalem, so somewhere around the 60s or thereafter, BC. See, Lord, and raise up for them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel, undergird him with the strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction, and their king shall be the Lord Messiah. Well, this sounds very much like Acts, doesn't it? Or Luke. We're going to look at Luke 21 in a second. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Did Luke have this particular passage in mind when he kind of paraphrased Jesus in the way he did in that verse? But you could see that this passage it could easily explain what the disciples say in Acts 1. You know, are you now going to destroy the kingdom of Israel? This attests to it. Don't know, for example, for certain what kind of a document Psalms of Solomon is. It's not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. My first learning of it associated with the Pharisees. Of course, there is more than one kind of Pharisee as well. But either way, this is before Christ, and it's a clear expectation that a Messiah will come. And no doubt, maybe Judas the Galilean knew of this text. Maybe Theudas knew of this text. And so, Messianic expectation. By the way, there is a section of 1 Enoch that has a lot of Messianic expectation. In fact, it talks about the Son of Man sitting on a throne, judging the nations. Sounds very much like Matthew 25. However, that particular section of 1 Enoch is not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I think most scholars, or many scholars, are very comfortable, including myself, with suggesting that that section of 1 Enoch, called the parables or similitudes of 1 Enoch, was probably not among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, that it's probably a 1st century AD, perhaps part of that document. It is possible that Matthew is in dialogue in the way Matthew portrays the Son of Man in Matthew 25. There is a striking similarity between the middle chapters of the parables of Enoch and Matthew 25. There could be some dialogue going on there. However, it is not likely that the parables were written until later, maybe around the time of Christ or even in the 1st century. Okay, Philo and Josephus, what do they have to say? Well, Philo doesn't say a lot about a Messiah, but it has been argued, and I'm convinced, in a couple places, the way that Josephus, or I'm sorry, the way that Philo, who of course wrote around the same time as Paul, or a little bit earlier than Paul, early 1st century AD, the way that he treats this passage in Numbers, a man will come out, in both Life of Moses and in his book on rewards, the way he presents that text, and of course it would not have been in Philo's interest to be explicit about his messianic expectation. That would not have been a wise thing for him to do in his writings. He would have gotten in trouble with the governing authorities. However, I think subtly he has hinted, in a way, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that if you're a Jew, you know what he's talking about. So I do actually believe that Philo, maybe toward the end of his life, developed a sense of messianic expectation. Josephus indicates that messianic expectation was one of the chief reasons for the Jewish war, which started in 66 AD. Their chief inducement to go to war was an equivocal oracle also found in their sacred writings, announcing at that time a man from their country would become ruler of the world. This is, again, that Numbers passage that Josephus is alluding to. Okay, well, there's a little bit on messianic expectation. This supports my thesis that the Jews were not expecting God to come to earth. Not all of them were even expecting a Messiah, but those that were expecting a Messiah were expecting an anointed human figure, for God to raise up an anointed human figure who would kick the Romans out of Dodge and restore the political kingdom to Israel. But that's what they were expecting. Of course, we now would say, as Christians, they received way more in a Messiah than they were expecting. Messiah 777, not 2.0, but 7.0 or something like that. Okay, well, let me briefly then end this video with a brief talk about Israel. So here's the passage that I find, this is the passage that really clicks it for me. In Luke 21:24, which is Luke's version of Matthew 13. Remember, Matthew 13 Mark 13 and Matthew 24 have this really cryptic, ambiguous statement. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, this is very ambiguous. Luke's not ambiguous, which is why I believe, well, not only that, but most scholars believe that Luke is using Mark as a source. But the best, and since Mark is written about 70, either right before or right after, Luke certainly knew what happened to Jerusalem when he was writing. And he seems to do a message version on this verse. Here's his rendering. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is nigh. And then he goes on to say, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the seasons of the Gentiles should be fulfilled. So what I take, the way Luke has paraphrased this, and of course, Luke is inspired. Again, I think if you're going to be a scholar, a biblical scholar, you have to get away from thinking of these documents in the way we think of how history is supposed to work. Yes, it is history. It's history, but it's history that can be edited in a creative way to bring across point. The point is the point, not the history. The history is not the main point, even though it's history. Don't get me wrong. And so I think Luke's paraphrase here is basically saying, yes, right now, as I am writing this, Theophilus, Jerusalem is under the control of the Romans. Yes, it doesn't look good for Israel, but we are in the times of the Gentiles. And eventually, the times of the Gentiles will be over. And then God will restore the kingdom to Israel. And he will do it by way of his Messiah. And this is where contemporary events, the Messiah has not come back to Jerusalem. The Israel that occupies Jerusalem and Judea and the Galilee, the Israel that is there today is not believing Israel. It is not Christian Israel. And therefore, it is not yet the true people of God. Hold that thought. Now, the book of Acts ends with this statement. Paul basically goes to the Jews in Rome. They don't accept him. Paul, frustrated, says, very well, I'm going to the Gentiles, and they will listen. And some have interpreted this statement in Acts 28 as Paul saying God is turning away from Israel forever. But as you can see, I don't think that is what Luke believes, both because of Luke 21 and because of Acts 1:6. I believe that in Luke's theology, we are in a period that he calls the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles will come to an end, I believe Luke says. So this statement here is an indication, it is an implicit explanation of why Israel is not in control of Jerusalem at this time. It seems to me that Luke is implying that the reason why God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed was because Israel did not believe in its Messiah. I believe that's the implicit message here. Again, feel free to disagree. But this sounds very much like Romans. A hardness has come from part of Israel until the fullness of Gentiles enter, and then all Israel will be saved. Some interpretation of debate about this verse, but it sounds like Paul, when you read that whole section of Romans 11, it sounds like Paul is saying something very similar to Luke. That is, that Israel is currently unbelieving Israel. And Israel is currently not true Israel for the most part. But there will come a time when the time of the hardness of them is over, when this time of bringing in the Gentiles is over, and then Israel will see a revival. They will be saved, as Romans 11 goes on to say, for the calling of God is without repentance. He seems to be talking about the calling of God toward Israel. There are other interpretations, but of course you see by this understanding, Israel is not yet the Israel promise. The Israel that is there now, I'm not going to say that God hasn't restored Israel as a nation. I'm not going to say it. I'm simply saying that according to Romans, they are still unbelieving Israel. According to Romans 9, the Israel that is in Israel is still not true Israel. And we have to be very careful here, because there are far more Palestinians who are Christians than there are Israelis who are Christians. And somehow the church has missed that point. The American church has put incredible support behind a nation that has not been particularly friendly to the true Israel, which are the Christians who are Palestinians in some cases. Now, that may sound a little provocative, but I don't see how it can be argued against. Now, you can say, well, they're not really Christians. They're high church Palestinians. Of course, there are Baptists. There's a Palestinian Baptist Bible College in Bethlehem, which is in Palestinian territory. And so I'm not trying to be anti-Israel here, nor am I saying that that 1948 wasn't part of God's plan. I wouldn't want to say that. I do want to say that there is a big, massive blind spot here when you realize how many Palestinians are Christians and how few Israelis are. But I do believe that Luke's theology looks forward to a time when Jerusalem and Israel's Messiah, Jesus, would be in control of Jerusalem. Jesus hasn't come back yet, though. Well, some thoughts for you to do with as you wish. This has been a little deeper look at Acts 1, 6 through 11.